All right, we're going to jump into lesson 13.3, which is on absolute value equations. And we'll start with a definition here. So absolute value is going to be the distance from zero. So a lot of times you're going to end up with two solutions here, because if they're asking you for the absolute value of, let's say, 3, they're asking you which two numbers are 3 units away from 0. Well, that could be 3 and that could be -3, right? They're both 3 units away from 0. So oftentimes with our absolute value, you're going to end up with two solutions because they're asking you for the distance from 0. And since this is a distance, right, we're not going to be able to have any negative numbers. So absolute value cannot equal a negative number because they're asking you for a distance from 0, and that wouldn't make sense to have a negative distance. But it is really important to note that before you can determine if your absolute value equals a negative number or not, you've got to isolate the absolute value first. And we're going to talk about what that looks like here in a second. So the first example asks, which of the following equations do not have a solution? Explain why. So remember, this is going to be anytime your absolute value equals a negative number, it's not going to have a solution because we can't have a negative distance. But like noted above, you've got to isolate the absolute value first. So notice we've got a negative sign on the outside here. We have to get rid of that negative sign before we can determine if there is a solution or not. So this is really saying -1 times the absolute value of x equals -4. So to get rid of this -1, I'm going to end up dividing by -1. And so then I'm going to end up with the absolute value of x equals, well, negative divided by a negative gives me a +4. And now we have the absolute value equals a positive number. So that means, yes, this will have a solution because the absolute value equals a positive number. Okay. We go to letter B, kind of tricky here because we have the absolute value. Notice it's isolated, right? And it equals 0. Well, 0 is not a negative number, right? We know that the number that's 0 units away from 0 would just be 0, so this is still okay, right? It's only when our absolute value equals a negative number that we're going to have no solution. Moving to letter C, notice the absolute value is isolated already. Even though there's a negative on the inside, we can't touch that. We're just worried about things that are on the outside, right? So if there's numbers on the outside, okay, then we have to get rid of them. But in this case, we have our absolute value, okay, nothing on the outside, and it equals a negative number. So this is going to be a no solution here. And then letter D, pretty straightforward here. Absolute value, right, of x. There's nothing on the outside, so it's already isolated. It equals a negative number again, so this is going to be no solution. And then letter E here, we've got our absolute value. Notice there's a negative on the inside, but we can't touch that right now, right? We only care about things on the outside that we need to get rid of at this moment. So that's no big deal. It's an absolute value. It equals a +7. So that means, yes, there is going to be a solution for this one. All right, let's talk about solving these equations. So like we said, most of the time there's going to be two solutions here. So the first step is going to be to isolate our absolute value, just like we noted above. So I'm going to make another little note here. So isolate the absolute value bars first. Okay, so anything that's on the outside of the absolute value, we've got to get rid of, and then we can determine if there's a solution, and if there is, then we can go ahead and solve it. So if I look at the first one here, we've got absolute value of x -10 equals -2. So if I want to isolate the absolute value, right, which means get it by itself, I need to get rid of this -10. So I'm going to start by adding 10 to both sides. And I get the absolute value of x equals 8. Okay, that's a positive number there. So we will have some solutions here. And then the next step is to break this into two equations here. So we're going to have x equals 8, and then we make another equation, x equals -8, and we decide if we have to solve anything there. No solving necessary, so we get our two answers here, right, which would be x equals 8, or x equals -8. So you're going to always end up with a positive version and a negative version when you set up those two equations, right? And then you'll solve them from there. Scrolling to letter B, same idea. We need to isolate the absolute value first. That means I need to divide by -3. And that means I divide the other side by -3. So I get the absolute value of m equals 9 divided by -3 is -3. So there's going to be no solution here because we have our absolute value and it equals a negative number. Moving to letter C, I got to isolate the absolute value. So I'm going to start by subtracting 1. And I get 1/3 absolute value of P equals 2. Now I need to get rid of this 1/3, so I'm going to multiply by 3. And I get the absolute value of P equals 6. And now we have a positive number here, so I will have solutions. I'm going to break this up into a positive version, P equals 6, and a negative version, P equals -6. Okay. And so now I'm going to go ahead and graph each one of these. So when they're asking for a graph, it's just single points, right? It's not arrows like we did with the inequalities. So 8 and -8 for the first one here. So I'm just going to go to 8, put a point there, and -8, put a point there, and that's my graph. No solution for this second one, so I don't need anything there. Moving to letter C, I go to -6 and +6, and that's all they're asking for there. Okay, we'll keep it going here. Crank it up a little bit. Letter D, same idea here, right? There is nothing on the outside of my absolute value, so I don't have to worry about getting rid of anything on the outside. So I'm ready to break this into two equations, because notice it's equal to a positive number. So I'm going to break this up. R minus 4 equals 5, and then R minus 4 equals -5. So again, the positive version, the negative version, and then for these we have to do a little bit of solving. So I'm going to add 4, and I get R equals 9, and over here I can add 4, and I get R equals -1, and I got my two solutions there, R equals 9, or R equals -1, and then I can put them on the graph here, -1 and 9. Okay, moving over to letter E. All right, notice we do have a number on the outside here. We've got this 2 being multiplied to my absolute value, so I got to start by dividing by 2 to both sides. And now I get the absolute value of D plus 4 equals 4. It equals a positive number, so there are going to be solutions, and I'll break it up into my two equations here. D plus 4 equals 4, and D plus 4 equals -4. So every time you see absolute value, you should be thinking two equations here. And then we'll go ahead and solve these. So I'm going to start by subtracting 4 here, and I get D equals 0, and subtracting 4 on the other side, I get D equals -8, and I've got my two solutions there. D equals 0. Let's retry that. D equals 0, and D equals -8, and I can put those onto the graph here at 0 and -8. Okay. Moving to the next page here. Same idea, just a little bit more complex with the equations that they have. All right, so there's a lot of stuff on the outside of these absolute value bars here, right? So we've got this +5 that's on the outside, and we've got this -3 being multiplied on the outside. We got to get rid of both of those. Let's start by subtracting 5. So I get -3 times the absolute value of 2w minus 6 equals -12. Okay, so notice it's still equal to a negative, but we need to get rid of that -3, so I'm going to divide by -3. on the left, divide by negative 3 on the right, and I get 2w minus 6 in my absolute value bars is equal to positive 4. Now it equals a positive number, so I will have some solutions. I'll break it up into my two equations here. 2w minus 6 equals 4, and 2w minus 6 equals negative 4. Okay. And so we end up with these two equations. Remember, you break it into two equations as soon as you've isolated the absolute value, so as soon as there's nothing left on the outside. And then from here, we'll go ahead and add 6. I'm going to get 2w equals 10. Divide by 2, and I get w equals 5. And on the other side, add 6. I get 2w equals 2. Divide by 2, and I get w equals 1. So I've got my two answers there at positive 1 and positive 5. Put them on the graph, and we're good to go. And finally, moving to the last one here. Okay, we've got two pieces on the outside. We've got a plus 3, and we've got this 4 that's being multiplied. Got to get rid of those things first. So I'm going to start by subtracting 3. Always undo the addition or subtraction first. And I get 4 times the absolute value of 1/4 b minus 1 equals negative 2. And I still got to get rid of that 4 on the outside, so I'm going to divide by 4. Okay, and we're going to end up with the absolute value of 1/4 b minus 1 equals, well, negative 2 divided by 4 is negative 1/2. Okay, and then if we take a second to look at this, hopefully we notice something about it. Hopefully we're noticing that this is a negative number on the right. Right, remember, when we isolate the absolute value, if it equals a negative number, then we are going to have no solution here. So for this one, we will have no solutions because our absolute value equals a negative number. And we can only make that determination after we isolate the absolute value, so after we get everything from the outside moved to the right. All right, that's it. Thanks for watching.